Okay, well today we're continuing our discussions on the Vietnam War. Look at the Gulf Tonkin Resolution, the Tet Offensive, how the war was fought, how it affected the United States, the 1968 election. Get at the Nixon administration, look at the Environmental Protection Agency, the SALT I Treaty, subsequent disarmament treaties, Watergate, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, the Camp David Accords, and their hostage crisis, situations in the Middle East. Okay. Well, as you see from the handout of the Vietnam War, Americans had been involved in Vietnam for a long time, but the American presence militarily had slowly escalated over the years. Eisenhower sent in the first military advisors in 1957. Kennedy increased the number of advisors, pushed them into more active combat role. But what was happening, though, was with the Viet Cong was you had this insurgency that is destabilizing South Vietnam, basically using hit-and-run guerrilla tactics. Well, I talked about at the beginning of the Cold War. The Cold War put American foreign policy in some very difficult situations from time to time. Like I said, we would often find ourselves in a position of backing up dictators in order to try to thwart communism. The situation in Vietnam was no different. Like I say, North Vietnam brutalized the native tribes in the jungles of North Vietnam, but what happened with the South Vietnamese government was, as the Viet Cong insurgency increased late 1950s and early 1960s, the South Vietnamese government routed up to 1 million peasants living out in the farms and rice paddies in the rural areas of South Vietnam, basically put them into concentration camps. And from there, took the men of fighting age, and took men of fighting age out of those camps, forced them into the army. The president of South Vietnam at the time, Ngo Dinh Diem, was extremely unpopular because of his policies. His government was very corrupt. And add to that, he was Roman Catholic in a land that is mostly Buddhist. It's a very intense protest against his regime. There's this one protest caught on a film. They had a Buddhist monk who sat in the middle of downtown Saigon and set himself on fire to protest the government. So the situation is just flying out of control rapidly. But when Johnson becomes president, he initially supported Kennedy's policies in Vietnam, but the situation in South Vietnam, however, was compounded in November 1963 when the military staged a coup against President Ngo Dinh Diem and overthrew him and assassinated him. So you have a serious problem in Vietnam in the early 60s is the elected government is overthrown by the military. So what little support it did have from the people is completely undermined. So they're essentially living under dictatorship, serious dictatorships. Now, Johnson had continued Kennedy's policies initially, but on August 2nd, 1964, North Vietnamese torpedo boats allegedly attacked an American destroyer in the Gulf of Tonkin, USS Maddox. See here on page 1026. Gulf of Tonkin, that's just off the coast of North Vietnam. There were international waters between the Gulf of Tonkin is between North Vietnam, China, and the large Chinese island of Hainan. Well, 2 days after the attack on the Maddox, American ships and the North Vietnamese Army patrol boats engaged in another skirmish in the Gulf of Tonkin. So Johnson declares that American forces had been attacked and asked Congress to give him all necessary authority to defend American positions in Vietnam. So Congress, as well, overwhelmingly passes what came to call the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, named after the incident in the Gulf of Tonkin, which ended up leading to the escalation of the war in rapid succession. Draft quotas were rapidly increased. American military presence rapidly increases. Because to protect American positions in South Vietnam, it meant that often American troops would not only have to defend bases and defend cities, but they'd also have to go out on patrols, out into the jungles, and actively engage North Vietnamese and Viet Cong units before they had a chance to strike at American or South Vietnamese targets. So by 1965, Johnson began full-scale bombing of North Vietnam and increased American troop strength from had been at 23,000 to 184,000 by 1965. As a result, more soldiers started dying in combat, and more soldiers sent in to combat the communists. As Secretary of Defense at the time, Robert McNamara promised the escalation of the U.S. presence in Vietnam would lead to the disintegration of communist forces. But there are several problems with that. One thing, North Vietnam is relying on weapons supplied by China and Russia. It's not from any manufacturing in Vietnam. And every year, tens of thousands of young North Vietnamese men came of fighting age, again fighting for the North. So Johnson found himself caught in a difficult situation. Already he's bombing North Vietnam at unprecedented rates. In fact, more bombs would be dropped on North Vietnam during the entire Vietnam War than were dropped by the U.S. During World War II. But suppose Johnson goes after China or Russia. Fear that a full-scale escalation will lead to World War III, while a pullout could cause a backlash at home and cause the whole nation to fall to the communists and cause America's allies to lose faith in America's commitment to them. So Johnson became determined not to become the first U.S. president to lose a war. By 1968, there were more than 536,000 American troops fighting in South Vietnam. 500,000 troops. Here's the whole thing about the Vietnam War. The United States never lost a major engagement in Vietnam. America took very heavy casualties in some engagements, but we never lost a significant battle. The problem with guerrilla insurgency, hit-and-run tactics, is North Vietnamese kept coming year after year after year. The South Vietnamese government had alienated its people. So South Vietnamese don't want to fight for their government, or if they do want to fight, it's usually with the Viet Cong. Make the situation even more difficult, this is also the first televised war. And so you had television during the Korean War, but not to the extent they did during Vietnam. So Americans are seeing these images of soldiers going into combat, the wounded on both sides, seeing pictures of American graves coming home. And as casualties mounted, more Americans began asking, just what exactly were we doing? So, protests began rising in the United States. Protesting of the war, calling it unnecessary, immoral, many protesting the draft. Okay, see, in those days, there was an active draft. So most of these men here are draftees. And you had college students who did not want to have to go leave everything behind and go to some war in Vietnam where they'd probably get wounded or killed. And so that makes the situation even more complicated. The 18, 19, 20-year-old men being drafted into the war had absolutely no say. Voting age until 1971 is 21. So the fighting continued. Protests escalated. Next time things take a serious turn in 1968, it became called the Tet Offensive. Tet is a Vietnamese holiday season, basically their version of New Year. And that year, the communists took the war from the countryside to the cities. And up to that point, U.S. officials were convinced that the war would soon be over and were stunned by the ferocity of Viet Cong attacks. America pushed the Viet Cong out of the cities, but with tremendous casualties on both sides. And the Tet Offensive turned out to be a military disaster for the Viet Cong, pushing back the military effort for years, but the offensive shattered the American public faith in the war and began intensifying the push for the return of American troops. But at that point, the American public had been told constantly, particularly by Defense Secretary McNamara, the war's going to be over soon. It's going to be won. Viet Cong is crumbling. Viet Cong put everything they had in the Tet Offensive into the cities, and that kind of strength led a lot of Americans to believe that the government was lying to them. Back in 1971, there's this very famous case called the Pentagon Papers case. The New York Times had gotten a hold of a secret history of the war in Vietnam, which had been published by the Defense Department. And so it had been published in the mid-1960s. Sitting around an empty desk, the New York Times somehow got a hold of it. And this report had concluded that there was no way the United States could win this war. And while Pentagon officials knew it, they persisted in fighting the war and maintaining that the United States was going to win at any time. And so a whole bunch of court cases over this eventually was published, the New York Times and the Washington Post. But beginning of a steady erosion in the American public's faith in the conduct of a government. So all of this, all these protests, near riots on some college campuses, you have race riots in cities, it's all feeding into the election year of 1968. It was a very bloody year in the United States. You have riots, demonstrations, assassinations spread across the nation, tearing apart the fabric of American society. Protests against the war in Vietnam escalated. Army recruitment offices are vandalized, and whole campuses shut down in protest of the war. And the strain of the war and the protests wore down Johnson, with the anti-war protesters hounding every move with a chance of, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? The war ended up destroying Johnson's presidency, as more funds were drawn from his Great Society programs to finance the war, what he called his guns and butter approach. Because Johnson convinced his allies in Congress that they could fund the war in Vietnam and fund his Great Society programs to help the poor here at home. And Johnson actually managed to do that. He kept the budget in balance, left office in 1969 with a budget surplus. the last president to do so before Bill Clinton did so in 2001. The attacks had wounded Johnson personally, and he died of a heart attack in 1973. So he got into the primaries. Initially, Johnson was expected to run for re-election in 1968. By January, had U.S. Senator Eugene McCarthy jumps in. He's a Democrat from Minnesota. Enters a protest chant against Johnson's policies in Vietnam. At that point, McCarthy really had been haven't heard of very much before. But he has his protest insurgency campaign, and did surprisingly well in the New Hampshire primary, winning nearly 40% of the vote. The thing is, though, Johnson wasn't even on the ballot. But with the success of McCarthy in New Hampshire, he ended up coming what they call the Dove candidate, the peace candidate. Showing peace at all costs, won a great deal of support from upper middle class whites and college students, basically the more liberal wing of the party. McCarthy captured the youth vote. He's urged college hippies to rejoin the mainstream. He said, "Come clean for Gene. Just get a shave and a haircut and go to work for his campaign." At that point, by March, Robert F. Kennedy jumps into the race. And so no love lost between Johnson and Kennedy. Kennedy was a devout defender of, actually ideologically, he and Johnson were very close on many issues. Kennedy was a very devout defender of civil rights, and had been pushing a lot of anti-poverty programs himself. The two men just didn't like each other, primarily because 1960, John F. Kennedy wasn't sure he wanted Johnson on the ticket with him, and sent his younger brother Bobby over to tell Johnson they were withdrawing their offer. But by the time Bobby Kennedy got to Johnson, John F. Kennedy changed his mind and already told Lyndon Johnson they wanted him on the ticket. So left Bobby Kennedy in a very delicate position. Well, Kennedy was fearing that his candidacy could divide the Democratic Party. So a lot of people were drawn to Kennedy because of his visions for peace and an end to poverty and civil rights, and also a lot of very fond memories of his slain brother. But nevertheless, in March, Kennedy threw off his fears and plunged into the race. He attacked the war and urged an end to poverty and racism in the U.S. The idealism mixed with pragmatism attracted minorities and blue-collar whites alike, although many of the blue-collar workers ended up supporting George Wallace, the segregationist governor of Alabama. There actually was an interview with one man about his support for Bobby Kennedy. He's a blue-collar guy, white, kind of conservative in his leanings. I understand he's supporting Robert F. Kennedy for president. Yeah, we all are. We like him. And but he supports civil rights for minorities. Shane, you don't like minorities? No, we really don't much around here. So, well, why are you supporting him? I said, well, just like him. And that's the thing about politics, though, is sometimes people support candidates. It may not necessarily make a lot of sense, but just something about that candidate personally just appeals to. That's the case of Bobby Kennedy, among many other things. Well, the campaign changed dramatically in March 1968 when Johnson delivered a stunning announcement in a televised address. At the conclusion of a televised speech regarding America's progress in Vietnam, Johnson announced he would neither seek nor accept another term as president. So essentially at that point, the fight became between McCarthy, Kennedy, and Vice President Hubert Humphrey. April 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. He'd been leading a series of protests on behalf of striking sanitation workers in the city. Kennedy was in Indianapolis, Indiana that night. When he heard the news, he was scheduled to address a largely African-American crowd that night. Advisors urged him not to go, but Kennedy went anyway. Kennedy announced to the shocked crowd that King had been killed. In fact, on the TV films, you could actually hear a lot of shock, gasps and screams. People heard about it for the first time. But Kennedy reached out to the crowd and urged them not to rise up in anger. He explained that he knew how they felt because his brother had been killed by a white man as well. And urged people in Indianapolis to remember what King had stood for and lived his whole life for, was peace and understanding. So riots broke out in 100 cities across the United States after the death of Martin Luther King. Indianapolis stayed quiet. So Kennedy had effectively stopped a riot. So who knows how many lives. 2 months later, after Kennedy had won the California primary, Kennedy himself was shot and killed. Basically, the sound of this man was a man named Sirhan, who was incensed over Kennedy's support of Israel in the Six-Day War in 1967. There was a brief movement to draft the surviving Kennedy brother, Ted Kennedy, who was a senator from Massachusetts, but Ted Kennedy, distraught, declined any attempt to put him on the ballot as either president or vice president. So, let's see, page 1031. So the Democrats end up nominating Vice President Hubert H. Humphrey for president. The Republican primary had a wide array of candidates, including New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, who was a liberal Republican, Governor of California at that time, Ronald Reagan, George Romney, who was governor of Michigan, actually Mitt Romney's father, the Republican nominee in 2012, and former Vice President Richard Nixon. Except Nixon cultivated a wide following within the Republican Party, but I always felt unappreciated and always felt kind of picked on. It really kind of rattled him a lot. After his defeat in the 1960 election and as a defeat in the run for governor of California in 1962, he had announced his retirement from politics, telling reporters that you won't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore. But Nixon manages to get the nomination. So out of a political retirement, jumps in again. But in the meantime, you have George Wallace running for president as well in the third party ticket, the American Independent Party. Wallace had started out Alabama politics as something of a martyr on racial issues, but race baiting cost him his first race for a governor, and after that he became an outspoken, ardent segregationist. In fact, at one point, standing in front of the door to the admissions office of the University of Alabama to prevent African American students from enrolling and registering, stating at one point in one of his speeches, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. So he won a lot of support from white supremacists across the country because of that speech. But Wallace was a power to be reckoned with in Alabama. In fact, in those days, governors of Alabama could not serve consecutive terms. What he did one point in the 1970s was had his wife run for governor after his term was up, and she won. Lurleen Wallace was the first woman governor of Alabama. There's actually a community college named after her up there. But Wallace ran on a platform attacking what he called the pointy-headed liberals in Washington, and attacks on what he called states' rights, which actually just a veiled way of saying he didn't like the federal government telling the states how to run their civil rights laws. But the interesting thing about Wallace is his last run for governor in the 1980s, he recanted his segregationist stands and won election as governor by winning the black vote. But in 1968, he's still a long way from that. Except it's a long, drawn-out campaign. Like I said, Nixon's running mate is a man named Spiro Agnew. He's the governor of Maryland. Agnew had constantly attacked the press for what he considered its liberal leanings, but the thing about the press is it's not their job to run someone else's campaign. Like I said, it's not the job of the media to run stories they think you're going to like. Humphrey's running mate was Ed Muskie. Wallace's running mate was a former Air Force general named Curtis LeMay. He had actually been on the Joint Chiefs of Staff under President Kennedy, but had headed him several times over a Cuban Missile Crisis and several other defense issues. LeMay went around the country actually saying the problem with the American public is they're afraid of nuclear war. Good man, why? But Nixon jumped to an early lead, appealing to what he called the silent majority. Basically appealing to the Americans who weren't out protesting, promising what he called law and order, essentially an end to riots and demonstrations in the country. Nixon had said, was very quiet on his plans for Vietnam. Simply said he was going to end the war in Vietnam, bring what he called peace with honor in Vietnam. But all he said about his plans for Vietnam was he had a secret plan for Vietnam, couldn't reveal at that time. He said no one really pressed upon it. Well, by the fall of 1968, Johnson ceased bombing of North Vietnam and announced the beginning of peace talks with North Vietnam, to try to end the war, which raised Humphrey's stock. And while polls narrowed very closely the latter days of the campaign, Nixon ended up winning winning the election. Let's get the exact numbers here. Wins just by 500,000 votes. 43.4% of the vote to 42.7% of the vote. Wallace gets 13.5%. Electoral College, Nixon gets 301 electoral votes. Humphrey gets 191 votes. Said Humphrey wins Texas, a former support of Lyndon Johnson. But you got 5 deep South states going for Wallace. Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Arkansas, for a total of 46 electoral votes. 1968, that was Arkansas's classic split personality election. Arkansas voted for Wallace for president, third party candidate. Winthrop Rockefeller for governor, Republican, and Democrat for U.S. Senate. And still retained a Democratic legislature. Basically, Arkansas is going in every direction at that point. But the election nationally goes to Nixon. Now, Nixon is a very strange bird. Gifted politician, had a lot of things going for him, but very cynical, very paranoid. And so everyone's out to get it. He's one of those politicians who could not understand that being at that level of politics, that no matter what you say or do, you're going to have a third of the country going to hate your guts, no matter what. He couldn't handle that. So he began putting together what he called an enemies list. Basically, politicians and reporters he felt were threats to him, and compiling information on them. The information about the personal lives, business lives, and information to try to undermine. Now, we talked about Herbert Hoover's Southern strategy for the 1920s. The 1960s, the Republicans are pushing this again, but much more quietly. The Democrats nationally embracing civil rights, but ends up happening, though, is the Democrats embrace more and more civil rights nationally. Southern conservatives who are upset with desegregation and integration left the Democratic Party. And so Nixon believed that if he could pull in those Southern conservatives, that could lead to a tremendous political strength to the Republican Party nationally. Basically pull them into an already growing conservative movement within the Republican Party. So as a result, Nixon ends up standing in the way of several desegregation integration orders, criticizing busing, actually trying to stand in the way of it. He's struck down by federal courts, but as a result, racial tensions in the country remain inflamed, and more Southern conservatives start jumping to the Republican Party. They take, for example, the case of Strom Thurmond. Elected as a Democrat in South Carolina, but he had been a segregationist. In those days, the 1940s, 1950s, the South was a one-party area. If you want to get anywhere in politics, you have to be elected as a Democrat. But by 1964, because of the Democratic Party's embrace of civil rights, so President Johnson signing the Civil Rights Act, Thurmond leaves the Democratic Party and joins the Republican Party, strictly on the basis of civil rights. And a lot of other Southern conservative Democrats are doing the same thing, going to the Republican Party. So into the 1970s, 1980s, you see this steady buildup of the Republican Party in the South based on those conservatives leaving the Democratic Party for the Republican Party. All in protest of desegregation. Now, environmental issues are starting becoming important in the 1960s, 1970s as well. Air pollution is becoming a serious concern in many cities. A lot of cities had smog alerts, where the air in some cities like New York and Los Angeles are basically unbreathable on some days. A lot of pollution of water from industrial runoff. And people realizing it's a serious problem because America's resources are being used up. Air in some cities is unbreathable, causing serious health problems for a lot of people, killing a lot of people. And so in 1970, Nixon signed into law the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, designed to regulate the pollution and environmental issues in the United States. Because there were very serious issues about pollution. One classic example of the 1970s is an area called Love Canal. It was a housing development in the suburbs of Buffalo, New York. Well, the thing is, Love Canal had been built on a toxic waste dump. Basically, this company years before had dumped all of its refuse products, which are poisonous, buried them underground at the site, but didn't tell anybody about it. So years later, somebody bought this land and built this housing development. What ends up happening is all these containers, all these toxic materials are leaking, and all this stuff bubbling up to the surface. People are getting sick, getting cancer. And so as a result, the entire neighborhood was condemned, shut down by the EPA. Another notorious example was Times Beach, Missouri. Little town on the map, but you'll never find on any maps anymore. What happened was in 1983, somebody had spraying the roads with a mixture of asphalt that was contaminated with a pesticide called dioxin, severely toxic. As a result, the entire city was shut down. All the people moved elsewhere, essentially because of pollution. And it's these kinds of issues Americans were facing in the 1970s, trying to regulate, control pollution, and not just for the environment overall, but for people's own health and health of their families. Now, the war in Vietnam continued for 4 more years. Nixon had gone to a policy what he called Vietnamization, that is trying to turn over more responsibility of the war over to the South Vietnamese troops. The problem was, like it had been in previous years, South Vietnamese really don't want to fight for their government. They feel no real interest in it. And Nixon resumes bombing North Vietnam, escalates it, in fact, even expands the war even further. 1970, Nixon authorizes the bombing of Cambodia. So you can go back here to page 1026. There's a supply route that Viet Cong used, the North Vietnamese Army used, called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. American name for it. And basically, it went, instead of going directly across the border with South Vietnam, it went across into neutral Laos, into neutral Cambodia, and dropping off supplies into South Vietnam. Troops and supplies, whatever else the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army needed. So in order to stop that, in 1970, Nixon starts bombing a neutral country, Cambodia. Like I said, countless people were killed in the bombings. What ends up happening is the Cambodian government destabilizes. There had been a peaceful kingdom ruled by a monarchy, Prince Norodom Sihanouk. The communist insurgency ends up growing in the country. The military overthrows Norodom Sihanouk, which only accelerated the popular support for the communist insurgency called the Khmer Rouge. Khmer was an ancient name for Cambodia. Rouge, it's French for red. Basically, communists. And so what the Khmer Rouge do is, by 1975, they end up taking over all of Cambodia. Now, they're very bizarre communist movements. Essentially, the Khmer Rouge decide that Cambodia had been contaminated by Western influence, and they're going to try to eradicate all Western influences and rebuild Cambodian culture and the communist image. So what they do is they empty out all the cities. They kill everyone who had been involved with the government previously, industry previously, anyone in any kind of education. Essentially, wearing glasses was enough to be killed by the Khmer Rouge because indication you could read. It had to, therefore, had some kind of education. They forced the people onto these mass plantations where families are split up and people are forced to work, basically enslaved. People are tortured and starved. And ultimately, the Khmer Rouge ended up killing 2 million people out of a total population of 10 million. So many dead they couldn't identify all the bodies. They couldn't even bury them all. The situation is so bad that in 1978, Vietnam, now united under the communists, invaded Cambodia in order to overthrow the Khmer Rouge. It's a famous movie from the 1980s called The Killing Fields, talking about how the Khmer Rouge takeover of Cambodia. But all that happened because Nixon started bombing Cambodia in 1970. Got even worse in 1971. Nixon decided to start bombing Laos. He doesn't have authorization from Congress to do either one, but he's bombing Laos, bombing neutral countries anyway. These are secret invasions, they were illegal, and they accomplished absolutely nothing. Well, now you get to the election of 1972. Nixon is renominated easily by the Republicans. The Democratic primary, however, is deeply divided and disrupted primarily by the Nixon campaign. Nixon's re-election committee, called the Committee to Re-elect the President, secretly engaged what they called dirty tricks against Democratic rivals, such as using hecklers, releasing rats in campaign speeches, and spying on campaigns. Now, South Dakota Senator George McGovern ended up winning the nomination for the Democrats. He's an outspoken liberal. He been a bombardier during World War II. Been running on a very liberal platform, one including guaranteed incomes for all Americans, amnesty for Americans who deserted the draft and left Canada. There's a fairly large number of those. Legalized abortion. Actually, abortion is only legal in 12 states at that point. It's going to be legalized by the Roe versus Wade decision in 1973, but already a lot of people were talking about it. Actually, critics called the McGovern campaign the abortion, acid, and amnesty campaign. But McGovern's appealing only to a very narrow portion of the American electorate, a very liberal portion. And his campaign is falling apart from the start. His first nominee for vice president, Senator Thomas Eagleton of Missouri, had to drop out. It was revealed he was seeing a psychiatrist for depression. Actually, a lot of people have depression, nothing wrong with it, but it also revealed he was receiving electroshock treatments. And that really rattled a lot of Americans who, electroshock was not an unusual treatment at that time, but the idea of the vice president having an electroshock treatment really rattled a lot of Americans, so Eagleton had to drop out. So Eagleton's replaced by Kennedy Cousin and former head of the Peace Corps, a man named Sergeant Schreiber. So they had to keep up the tabloids. That was Arnold Schwarzenegger's father-in-law. His daughter was a famous reporter, married Arnold Schwarzenegger, him, governor of California. So the campaign's going along. McGovern's basically falling apart, lagging deeply in the polls. Said Nixon would have had this thing in the bag, but he overplayed his hand. June 17th, Nixon aides broke into the Democratic National Headquarters of the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C., attempted to wiretap the Democrats. See, the Watergate complex, that is a huge complex of office buildings and apartments. Like I said, it's a very nice area. But to understand what's happening here is Nixon is ordering a break-in. Order people to commit a crime in order to try to wiretap and spy on his opponent's campaign. Five men were arrested in what the Nixon administration officials dismissed as a third-rate burglary. McGovern briefly tried to make an issue out of the incident, but no avail. Campaign goes on, and Nixon walls McGovern by 18 million votes, winning every state except Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. And despite his rousing victory, one of the largest in U.S. history, Democrats retained control of the House and Senate. Questions about the Watergate break-in continued to fester and eventually explode out of the open. Nixon gets 60.7% of the vote, 520 electoral votes. McGovern gets 37.5%, 17 electoral votes. Remains that George Wallace's organization runs candidate John G. Schmitz, a conservative congressman from California, the American Party ticket. He gets 1.7%. And George Wallace had ran for president in 1972 as a Democrat, but was shot and paralyzed during the campaign and had to drop out. So now we get into 1973. Watergate breaks out into the open. Now, ever since, Watergate has been an enduring symbol of the abuse of political power in the United States. In fact, today the suffix "gate" is applied to any political scandal. Everything is always something gate because of Watergate. Well, the scandal sickened the nation, shattered the trust that many Americans had in the integrity of the U.S. government. In fact, ever since, Americans have had a steadily declining opinion of government. Now, it wasn't sure for a long time whether Nixon had any knowledge of the break-in, but from the beginning, it was clear that he feared his inner circle could be implicated. Well, 6 days after the break-in, Nixon ordered the CIA to keep the FBI off the case. Essentially, obstruction of justice, trying to keep law enforcement authorities from investigating the crime. Nixon said it's a national security matter. And Nixon began to urge his aides to lie to cover up the incident. So lie to courts, lie to investigators, lie to Congress, lie to the press. Basically try to deflect any type of suspicion. Remember, lying to court, lying in court, lying in Congress, that's called perjury. That's a felony. And conspiring with somebody to commit perjury, commit a felony, that's a felony too. Well, after the federal judge involved in the first cases, John Sirica, he sentenced the Watergate burglars to long prison terms. The burglars began to talk, implicating the committee to re-elect the president. So what's happening was Nixon tried to bribe the Watergate burglars to keep them quiet. As the Watergate scandal unfolds, it's learned that Nixon actually had this secret slush fund. Basically, he shook down corporations and donors for the cash so he could use to bribe witnesses. In fact, there was one case, this one telephone company, ITT. Nixon basically shook down for a bunch of bribes so ITT could get government contracts. That was considered to be a big scandal for Watergate erupted. On top of his testimony that shocked the nation, White House aide John Dean told Congress that Nixon had ordered a cover-up. He ordered a cover-up. And years later, Nixon aides revealed that Nixon did know about the break-in and had ordered it. But this wasn't the first time they'd done something like this. Nixon aides had been breaking into people's homes and offices for years. About the Pentagon Papers case, the New York Times reporter involved a man named Daniel Ellsberg. He was seeing a psychiatrist for all the stress he was under surrounding the Pentagon Papers case, and Nixon ordered his aides to break into the psychiatrist's office to steal Ellsberg's records. Well, soon the nation learned that Nixon had secretly recorded his Oval Office conversations, which by itself wasn't illegal. Roosevelt, Kennedy, and Johnson all have done similarly on various occasions. But the thing is, Nixon's recording himself ordering a break-in and ordering a cover-up of Watergate. As some critics, Nixon said he's bugged himself. Well, at that point, the special prosecutor named Archibald Cox tried to gain the tapes, and all starts falling apart here. It's in October 1973 called the Saturday Night Massacre. What happens is Archibald Cox is trying to subpoena the president for these tapes, or all sorts of shenanigans going on, including events surrounding Watergate. And so what Nixon's going to do is he decides he's going to fire the guy investigating. He can't do it directly himself. He has to go to his Attorney General. So one night in October 1973, he orders the Attorney General to fire Cox. The Attorney General refuses and resigns. Nixon goes to the number 2 man at the Attorney General's office. He refuses and he resigns. So finally down to the Solicitor General, a man named Robert Bork, who finally fires Cox. Fires the guy investigating Nixon. Well, a huge uproar occurs, and Nixon has to appoint another special prosecutor. And Nixon ended up fighting all the way up to the Supreme Court, try to keep from releasing these tapes. June 1974, the case U.S. v. Nixon, Supreme Court orders that Nixon has to turn over these tapes to investigators. The problem wasn't just Nixon and aides immediately surrounding him involving Watergate. It's also Spiro Agnew. October 1973, he's plagued by his own scandal. He's forced to resign as he pled guilty to an unrelated income tax evasion charge. Basically, he's being bribed. He didn't report it on his taxes. Yes, you do have to report bribes on your taxes. And so for his first time since his adoption in 1967, the 25th Amendment is invoked. It was partially designed because of events surrounding the Wilson's stroke in 1919 and Kennedy's assassination in 1963. What if you have a president who is completely incapacitated? The 25th Amendment specifies what happens if there's a vacancy in the vice presidency. That the president can name a new vice president with majority approval by Congress. And if a president dies or resigns in office, the vice president does become, in name, in deed, and power, the president of the United States. But if the president is incapacitated, the vice president will only become the acting president until such time as the president is deemed able to resume his duties. So, Nick Agnew resigned from the vice presidency, goes to jail for a long time. New vice president needed, so they choose House Minority Leader Gerald Ford of Michigan. So Ford is now vice president. In fact, he's the only vice president ever to have been elected to the office. Well, soon after the tapes are turned over, Nixon's presidency disintegrates. After on evidence compiled by Senate investigators, House Judiciary Committee voted on 3 articles of impeachment against Nixon. Included 1, abuse of power; 2, obstruction of justice; and 3, contempt of Congress. Essentially, all of those charges are related to each other. From Nixon ordering the aides to lie, cover up, and not to cooperate with Congress, official subpoenas from Congress. Actually, there were 2 other impeachment charges that they voted on, but were rejected. One was income tax evasion against Nixon, that basically related to Nixon's secret slush fund. He didn't report any of those. And attempted impeachment for the bombing of Cambodia. The side focused instead strictly on Watergate. So the House Judiciary Committee basically is designing the House's case against Nixon for impeachment. Now, the way the impeachment process works is the House basically votes whether or not to indict the president or a federal judge. Like I say, impeachment is basically an indictment. And then, from that point, he goes over to the Senate for trial. And 2/3 majority vote, the Senate will vote up or down whether or not to convict and remove that offender from office. President or federal judges, several judges have been impeached and removed from office before. So, it's August by this point. The House is about to proceed with the impeachment. And Republican congressional leaders go to Nixon on August 8, 1974 and tell him, there's no way you're going to survive this. That he's going to be impeached, he will be convicted, he will be removed from office. The result of this, on the night of August 8, Nixon informs the nation in a televised address that he would resign the next day. Nixon quietly left Washington upon his resignation on August 9, 1974. There's a picture of it here. Picture Nixon 1057. Yeah, him resigning on 1061. Nixon quietly left Washington upon his resignation, saying farewell to White House staff and stepping on Air Force One. Gerald Ford then took the oath of office as the nation's 38th president. And ultimately, 25 White House officials were convicted because of Watergate. Let's say 24 White House staffers going to jail, all surrounding Watergate. Now, Ford's presidency was racked by a sagging economy and lingering resentment over the Watergate scandal. Now, although Nixon had resigned, he's still facing potential criminal charges. Now, on September 8, 1974, rather than allow Watergate to continue with a criminal case against Nixon, Ford pardoned, shocking the nation. Now, some critics charged that Nixon had made a secret deal with Ford for the pardon, but no such evidence of such deals ever come to light. Ford declared at that point, our long national nightmare is over, and Watergate was effectively over. But because of the Watergate scandal, Republicans lost dozens of seats in Congress in the midterm elections that year. And towards the end of the Nixon administration, into the 40 years, inflation was an increasing problem. Nixon instituted the early 1970s called wage and price controls to try to control inflation. Basically setting specific prices for specific products. Essentially trying to outlaw inflation, trying to end inflation by outlawing it. So all this is connected to the continuing war in Vietnam. It's draining a lot of resources from the United States. And so it caused prices start going up. Like I said, throughout most of the 1970s, you'll still be dealing with the after effects of that. So wars have, long-term wars have a very difficult impact on any economy. So in 1975, Ford passed a $22 billion tax cut to try to stem rising inflation, but the resulting deficits kept inflation above 5% annually in 1976. Rapid increases in world population in the 1960s and 1970s, poor harvest in the 1970s led to a 20% increase in food prices in the United States alone in 1973. During the 1970s, prices of loaf of bread increased from 24 cents to 89 cents. Price of an automobile jumped 72% between 1973 and 1978, causing a surge of cheaper, more fuel-efficient foreign imports, which damaged the American auto industry. In the 1970s, Detroit's pulling all these huge tanks and all these mechanical problems, not very fuel-efficient, and these smaller, more fuel-efficient Japanese cars start coming on the market. They're a lot cheaper, so people start buying them, so it starts cutting into the American auto industry, causing a lot of damage for it. Well, Ford tried to rally confidence in the American consumer by trying a variety of approaches to combating inflation. One of these was a disastrous Whip Inflation Now campaign. Whip Inflation Now turned out to be a little more than just a series of publicity stunts, and the president wearing buttons saying WIN for Whip Inflation Now. And the campaign was an embarrassing failure for Ford. American military involvement in Vietnam had ended in January 1973 after the Paris Peace Accords negotiated by Secretary of State Henry Kissinger negotiated an end to the war with the North Vietnamese. Now, the terms of this meant fighting would stop, all sides would stop fighting, and the United States would pull its forces out of South Vietnam. Now, the Nixon administration, given what are called private assurances of the South Vietnamese government, they wouldn't allow the North Vietnamese to attack, but America is exhausted after the war and wanted nothing more to do with it. American involvement in Vietnam left 2.2 million dead, including 57,000 Americans. Technically, the war was a draw. The United States had not lost any ground. They had kept the South Vietnamese government intact and independent, but they were not able to deflect the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces. They never lost an engagement, technically a draw, but the divisions in America over it, the damage done, and the cost of lives for many Americans made it feel like a defeat. Couple that with Watergate and economic problems caused by inflation. The Americans were very frustrated in the 1970s. Well, the war in Vietnam, the phase of the North Vietnamese called the American War, the settlement didn't last long. In early 1975, North Vietnam invaded South Vietnam. Chaos ensued. The army and government collapsed, and on April 30th, 1975, the South Vietnamese capital, Saigon, fell to the communists. The United States did not intervene. Now we go to the 1976 election. Ford's lackluster record in Watergate emboldened the Democratic hopes of recapturing the White House in 1976. Hitting back the rate of about a dozen candidates, including Texas Senator Lloyd Bentsen, Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter captured the Democratic nomination. He served one term as Georgia Governor, won over people with his homespun charm and his promises to people that telling them, I'll never tell a lie. This candid outsider approach really impressed the American people, but starting off the campaign in 1975, a lot of people knew who Jimmy Carter was. In fact, the headline in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the biggest paper in Georgia, was Jimmy who's running for what? But Ford's facing his own problems. He had a very bruising primary battle with the California Governor Ronald Reagan, pushing a conservative insurgency. I say, in fact, the fight goes all the way to the convention. What happens, though, is because of conservatives are so upset with Ford being used too liberal, Ford dumps his not vice president, Nelson Rockefeller. Because Ford became president, he had to choose another vice president. In this case, Nelson Rockefeller, in favor of the conservative Kansas senator Bob Dole. Carter chose Walter Mondale, Minnesota senator, as his running mate. Well, Carter ran into trouble as he wavered on the issues, but Ford had his own problems. Number of falls on the golf course and airport runways, a little to inspire confidence. Although he had been an athlete, he gained a reputation as a klutz because he's always seen as falling down on TV. In a nationally televised debate in the autumn of 1976, the first presidential debate since 1960, Ford made a tremendous mistake by saying there was no Soviet domination of Poland, which actually was a Soviet satellite at the time. Carter won a narrow victory in November. Carter gets 50.1% of the votes, 297 electoral votes. Ford gets 48%, 240 electoral votes. A couple third-party candidates don't worry about, but Mondale's Carter's running mate. He's running for the president's nomination in 1984. So it goes to Jimmy. And they're in his the 70s.